Welcome everyone. We're going to give everyone a minute to come in. But while you are joining us, we would love to hear where you are and what migrants you're seeing this week, because man, it's happening. Here anyway, I'm in Asheville, North Carolina, so they're coming through here fast and furious. And where did you see them? It's because you might be not home. So. And I hope everyone is able to use the chat. I'm pretty sure I have it set up right. I know last year we had a few issues. So we'll give everyone a minute and then I'll start with, here we go. Thank you, Lori. Lori Hoppy from Lakewood Ranch. So our chat is working.
Did notice the bald eagles are back down by Oscar Shearer. They're out and having a good time down there, seeing them every day.
All right. All right, the Whites are visiting our tuned in from Charlottesville, Virginia. Love it. Jean saw a yellow-bellied sapsucker during the quad survey. All right. And a northern house wren. Cool.
That's awesome.
Christine Summers is in Easton, Pennsylvania. We're getting folks from all over. I love it. Janet Paisley says Charlottesville, Virginia is getting lots of warblers, vireos, and thrushes. Glorious. Yeah. All heading to Sarasota. And points further on sometimes, right? Yoli Maurice.
Sandpiper.
Solitary sandpiper, yeah. Oh, at Mayaka, a couple hours ago. Great. Mayaka's glorious right now. Margie, you also saw the solitary sandpiper. Were you at Mayaka, Margie, when you saw it?
My neighborhood.
All right, in Lakewood Ranch. Cool.
Yeah.
Carol, hello from Wilmington, Delaware. Mary Alice Curtis from Lakewood Ranch saw a Tennessee warbler in Glebe Park. Cool. All right. Lisa Sykes haven't seen much yet. All right. You're 10 minutes from celery fields. You should see plenty. Okay. All right. Well, I'll give a little background refresher since it's been a long summer. Welcome to Sarasota Audubon's virtual general meeting. Thanks for joining us. We have almost 60 people here, so great. Nice turnout for an October night. I'm Karen Willey. I'm your Zoom moderator. We'll start with a short business meeting led by Sarah Reisinger, our esteemed president, and Jean Doobie, who is our treasurer, will give you a report from last year's books. And then program director Margie Haas will lead the presentation portion with our speaker. So this is a webinar, not a meeting, so we won't see you, but you'll see us. At any time during this webinar, you can, if you have a question for Rebecca, please put questions for her in the Q&A part on the bottom, maybe on the top, depending on where your controls are. There's a Q&A, and we like to use that for the speaker questions. If you have questions for the moderators about the general Zoom or anything, put that in the chat. We will monitor both, but it's easier for us to keep track of questions for the speaker in Q&A. So, and we will, the speaker, Rebecca Heisman, will address your questions after her presentation. So I will turn it over now to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back for the season. We're going to kick it off actually with our annual report that Jean is going to give you. This is for last year's financials. It was a great year and a great way to kick off the year is to celebrate how well we did last year. So take it away, Jean.
Okay, I think Karen's going to put share a screen here
Yeah.
of we use QuickBooks to do our financials. This is an Excel spreadsheet where I've taken the 6 pages and put it onto one page. So let's have a look at
Oh,
the
first you want the other one.
if you could do the P&L
Yes.
first. So our operating results, we did very well. Our total revenue for the year was, if you could scroll down just a little bit, Karen, $122,676, and about 56,000 of that was in donations, which is really wonderful that you guys come through. These are general donations that go to the Nature Center, and they do not entail the quad, by the way. And our expenses for the year were 104,000. You can see that at the bottom. And therefore, we had an excess of $18,331, which is really wonderful that we are always in the black and we continue to always be in the black. After the year is ended in June, the board then decides what to do with the excess funds. And by board motion, we put 5,000 into the endowment funds, 5,000 into the Celery Fields Explorers Fund, which is our children's program. And then we're building up our building fund with the balance of $8,331. So that takes care of that. And now let's take a look at our balance sheet. We have a very strong balance sheet. We have current assets of 776,000. And our building, as you know, cost us over, on here, 1.3 million. We have depreciation every year. So the value of the building now is 887,000. Total assets of 1,670,000. And if you just scroll down just a little, we have designated funds. These funds are from donations that come through. They are not related to operating expenses. These are donations that people specifically say, I want my money to go to X, Y, and Z. So with the designated funds, you can see that we have a building fund, we have the Explorers Fund, our endowment funds, the quad fund, and the 2 education funds. Just one note about the quad fund. We are in partnership with Big Waters. They collect money, we collect money. When we have excess money, we send it to Big Waters because they're paying all the bills. So at the end of the year, we are holding $66,000. So all in all, it's a strong balance sheet and we've done really, really well. Thanks to everybody who donated, who helped try and keep our costs down, and for Sarah's leadership this past year. So if anybody wants to look at these numbers, they can send me an email and we can take a deep dive into them if you want. So.
Yeah, we're happy to share any of the numbers. I'm really proud of everything we accomplished in the last year. Everybody worked hard. We got through 3 hurricanes and came out strong. It was a great year. For this upcoming year, we have some new programs that we are launching. Do you have slides for these, Karen?
Only this one.
Okay. Okay, so let me just start by saying we have some exciting events that we are launching this year. Forrest Rowland, who sort of runs an ecotourism company, Rock Jumper, has wants to do some walks and he's going to teach some classes for us, but he is doing these walks that are a little further afield than we've normally gone, but he is spectacular. And this first one's in Fort DeSoto, very early in the morning, October 19th at 7:30 a.m. to noon. So you would register for that online just so he knows who to be looking out for, because it is a little bit far afield, and then we'd have your phone number and everything. So
that is found on the website, there's a
Yes.
registration tab, and when you click on that, you'll see the events tab. And then on that page, you'll see all the things that you can register for. So,
And he is totally captivating and fun, and he'll be a fantastic guide. It will be a great experience. Additionally, we will be offering lots of classes this year. They're not all on the calendar yet, but as they come available, members will have the first crack at registering for these classes. Some of the classes, we have one free class that we'll be offering repeatedly throughout the year. It's Birding 101. And it's really an entry-level class for anybody who wants to get into birding. Or, you haven't been birding in a long time. It teaches you how to use your binoculars appropriately. It also teaches you how to use eBird and Merlin so that you can kind of go out on your own and feel confident getting started as a birder. And if you like that class, or if the new people that are trying it out like it, they can move on. We have a Birding 201, which is more like an intermediate birding. And then we also have, for advanced birders, an avian field methods class. We also have some other ones that are coming up. I think there's a bird behaviors class. There's going to be a warbler identification later in the year. There's a whole litany. Jamie Rotenberg has come up with quite a course catalog for us that we can offer, and members get 50% off. So it'll be, for most classes, it's $10 for members and $20 for anybody outside the organization. And like I said, members will get first crack at that. You'll have to log into your Member Planet account, which you can find that link in the website. But also, when we send the email out to members saying it's time you can register for the classes, we'll have a way for you to log in, and with a link to the classes so that you can go straight to that page and register. It will recognize you as a member if you're logged in, and you'll get the member discounted price. So it's a real benefit, and I'm very excited. We've got some great teachers and some great content coming your way on that. The other big exciting, oh yeah, and go ahead and buy your holiday luncheon is up. So go ahead and buy your holiday luncheon tickets. It is on December 10th this year at 11:30 a.m. So put that on your calendar and get your tickets and get all reserved. I need to do that as well.
nobody's registered yet, so that's why the website's ready now. So sign in, and you can find it on our website under registration tab, and then events. Everything.
Yeah, they've got a really Harma put together a really great program for the presentation during the luncheon this year. It's going to be very exciting. Additionally, we tested out the Sarasota Audubon Day Festival in February last year, and it was very successful with very limited planning and sort of thrown together. So we decided to blow it up into a much bigger event this year. It will be in February, on February 21st from 9 to 2, and we're calling it Fly Wild. And we've got a number of really great things happening on the day. First, we're going to have a birdathon. So you can get teams of up to 4 together. We're going to hash out the rules will be available. Those are still in the works, but there will be a birdathon that will culminate on the day of the festival. We'll have a kids scavenger hunt with some really amazing prizes. Lisa Sykes has been working on some really awesome stuff for both the birdathon and the kids scavenger hunt on the day. We will have tours of the quad for the neighborhood. So at that point, we'll be open to be able to show where we're at with the quads and what we're doing. We'll have trolleys running to the quads and to Raymond Road Boardwalk. The naturalists will be staffed all day long, and we'll have really fun bird walks throughout the day, and tons of great vendors coming this year. So if you want to help out with this festival, we could definitely use your help. It's a big undertaking, and we would love your help. If you want to email me at SarasotaAudubonPresident@gmail.com, I can get you going on some really fun tasks to get that underway. And that's about it. I'm so excited to get all these things going this year. We have great bird walks coming up. Keep an eye on the calendar for everything that's upcoming, because we've got some great content this year.
And we'll be sending you out an e-blast once all those classes are ready for you to register. Still getting there. All right, Take it away, Margie.
So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Rebecca Heisman, who's talking to us about wild stories from the history of bird migration research. And Rebecca describes herself as a bird writer for hire or a birdie writer. She is an award-winning science writer on the ornithology and bird conservation beat based in Walla Walla, Washington, which is the east side of Washington state. She has contributed to many publications, including Audubon and Cornell's Living Bird. She's worked with organizations including the American Bird Conservancy, the International Scientific Wilson Ornithological Society, and the American Ornithological Society. Wow. Her first book, Flight Paths, published by HarperCollins, tells the epic scientific story of how we know what we know about bird migration. And it got great reviews, so make sure you get a copy. The Wall Street Journal said Flight Paths does what only the best science books can do. It adds to our knowledge of the world without diminishing its wonder. And Scott Weidensaw, who also was our featured speaker several years ago and author of many books about birds, including A World on the Wing, which is also about migration, says that Heisman is the ideal guide to the world of groundbreaking bird migration scientists. Quote, curious, chatty, and adept at making sometimes complex research easily understandable. I can't recommend it highly enough. And also, you may have seen Rebecca around a lot. She has I think it's widely distributed monthly email newsletter called Bird of Passage. And you might want to subscribe to it. It's about birding, nature, living with climate change, and also is a curated selection of bird news from around the internet, science, and nature book recommendations. So take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. That was such a kind introduction. All right, I'm gonna share my screen, see if I can get this going. All right. So yeah, thank you all so much for having me. I admit when we were talking before this started, I had to look at a map to refresh my memory of where in Florida Sarasota is, but that's okay because most people don't know where in Washington Walla Walla is. So I am physically right now located about as far from Seattle as you can be and still be in Washington, if that helps. So I'm so happy to be speaking to you all this evening. As Margie said in that introduction, I am here because I'm the author of a book that came out, gosh, 2.5 years ago now, which is incredible, about the history of bird migration research, how we know what we know about bird migration. And so that's Flight Paths, the book that you see here. I spent about 2 years of my life immersed in this topic. I read more scientific papers than I could possibly keep count of. I talked to dozens of scientists, including obviously a lot of ornithologists, but also a surprising number of computer scientists and electrical engineers and folks like that. I got to join a few of those ornithologists in the field to tag along while they were actually carrying out their work and collecting their data. And the whole thing was an amazing experience. I feel really privileged that I get to tell the stories of the scientists who are profiled in this book. I still feel like they're the real experts, and I'm just here trying to bring the amazing things that they're doing to a wider audience. And getting to tell those stories is such a fun job to have because there are so many good stories to tell about bird migration. So these are just a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book. On the lower left here, this is a bar-tailed godwit. These are the birds that make the longest non-stop documented migratory flight. In the fall, they take off from Alaska and they fly all the way across the Pacific Ocean and do not touch down again until they reach New Zealand or thereabouts. In the middle, this bird is called a bar-headed goose. They make what is probably the highest altitude bird migration in the world. Every year they fly back and forth over the Himalayan mountains during their migration across Asia. And then in the upper right, that guy you guys should be familiar with, this is a blackpoll warbler. They, in the fall, so in spring, they come up through your area. You probably see blackpoll warblers heading north through Florida in the spring, but in fall, they usually bypass you guys. And to get from New England down to their wintering grounds in northern South America, they launch themselves out from New England and spend 3 days just flying over the open water of the Atlantic Ocean nonstop, which seems less impressive than the bar-tailed godwit taking like a week to cross the Pacific Ocean. But a bar-tailed godwit is about the size of a football, and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. So it's just astonishing. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we figured all of this out. How do we know the facts that I have just shared with you about these three birds? How do we know these things are true? And so that's what my book is really about, the backstory of all these facts that we know about migration. And that's what I'm here to talk a little bit about this evening. So before I fully launch into that, I should give a little bit more background about myself and how this book came to be. For several years now, I have been a full-time freelance writer, but before COVID, I worked full-time for the American Ornithological Society, which is the big professional organization in America for bird scientists. And I was their one-person communications department, so I wore a lot of hats. And this organization, one of the things that they do is they publish 2 peer-reviewed scientific journals, which are what you see here, which are where ornithologists publish their new research, like their new discoveries, their new findings to share with other scientists. And so one of the many tasks that I took on there was promoting the research being published in these journals, turning them into blog posts, press releases, things like that. So I was reading a lot of scientific papers. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the format of a scientific paper. They all follow the same basic structure. So they start out with the introduction, where the researchers explain what question they were trying to answer and why, and kind of give some background information. And then there's the methods, where they go step by step through the procedures that they used to collect and analyze their data. And then there's the results in the discussion, where they talk about what they found and why it matters and where things might go from here. So I was reading all of these papers, and I kept getting sucked into and fascinated by the part that I think a lot of people might skim over to get to the results, which is the method section, the how they were carrying out these projects. I did not know, or if I had learned in my undergraduate ornithology class, I had forgotten, that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study bird migration by putting out microphones to automatically record the calls of birds as they pass overhead at night. You can study bird migration by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. I'm not going to talk about that one in my talk this evening, but it is just wild, and there's a whole chapter in the book trying to unpack in as non-technical a way as possible how on earth that all works. And so I was reading all these papers, and I just started thinking, who even figured out that you could do this? Like, who first figured out that you could put a feather through a mass spectrometer and figure out where that bird had been? Like, who figured all of this out, and how does this even work? How does the science behind these different methods work? And so when the COVID pandemic happened, I ended up leaving that job. And what I did was I decided to write the proposal that eventually turned into my book. So in the book, I cover a lot of ground. The way I ended up structuring it was I kind of go chapter by chapter through each of the major methods that have been developed to figure out birds' movements on these long distance migrations, roughly in chronological order. So starting with the origins of scientific bird banding way back in the early days of the 20th century, and going all the way up through the latest high-tech advances like high volume genomic sequencing and things like that. And when I first started getting invited to do book talks like this, I realized that there was no way that I could cram all of this into, a book talk that would come in at under an hour. And so I decided that the best approach and the most fun approach for talks would be to zoom in on just a few of my favorite stories from the book and share those to hopefully whet your appetite for more. So that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to share the stories of three of my favorite migration innovators who I learned about while reading while writing the book, gosh. And my hope is that you will come away from this talk with a new appreciation for all of the hard work and creativity that went into uncovering every gee whiz fact that you might hear about bird migration. This is the table of contents of the whole book, in case that wasn't clear. So the first migration scientist I want to talk to, or the first migration, let's say the first migration monitoring technique that I want to talk about tonight is one that I had not even heard of before I started doing the research for this book. And this is called moon watching. So most songbirds migrate at night. There's a variety of reasons for that. But for researchers, the upshot is that it means that we can't, if we want to see what these migrating birds are doing, we can't just look up and observe their behavior as they pass overhead, because not only are they potentially kind of small and flying pretty high up, but also it's dark outside, so we just can't see them. So if we want to observe these night migrants, we have to get creative to see what they're up to. And today we have all sorts of tools like radar and satellite telemetry to help us spy on these night migrating birds. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do this using just a telescope. So George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913. He finished his master's degree from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge in 1936, and he stayed on there as an instructor and an ornithologist for the rest of his career and helped found the university's Museum of Zoology, which is still operating today. Now, being an avid birder his whole life, he was fascinated with birds from a very young age. So being an avid birder his whole life and growing up along the coast of Louisiana, George Lowry would have been very familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout. You guys are on the Gulf Coast, so I probably don't have to explain this to you, but I've explained it to groups from elsewhere who might be less familiar. This, of course, is when birds are flying north in the spring, crossing the Gulf of Mexico en route from South America to North America. Sometimes, depending on the weather conditions, they will just sort of fall out of the sky en masse as soon as they get to land because they're so exhausted. So in the first, patch of habitat behind the beach, you can get these incredible concentrations of every variety of migrating songbird that you might imagine just dripping out of the trees. And although there wasn't really any way to prove it at the time, a lot of ornithologists in the early 20th century, George Lowry included, thought that it was likely that migrating birds crossed over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, that this was a normal part of the annual cycle of these birds. Then in the 1940s, another biologist named George Williams, this gets a little confusing because both these guys are named George. So we had George Lowry and now we have George number 2, George Williams, comes along and says, hang on, this makes no sense. Why would all of these birds voluntarily choose to fly all the way across the Gulf of Mexico when Mexico is right there? Like they got to be going the land route. This is the only thing that makes sense. I know we don't see them there, but we're just not looking hard enough. This has got to be it. Now, George Lowry, who had seen the admittedly circumstantial evidence of trans-Gulf migration with his own eyes in the form of fallout, was really annoyed by this. And so these two Georges had quite the testy back and forth in the scientific journals of the day debating this. And George Lowry got to be really, really, really determined to prove George Williams wrong and show once and for all that large volume trans-Gulf migration was real. And so he started casting around for an idea, thinking of how he might do this. And he remembered some quirky ornithology papers that he had read from the early years of the 20th century, where folks had reported looking at the full moon through a telescope during bird migration season and being able to see the silhouettes of night migrating birds passing in front of the moon, sometimes so clearly that they could even tell what type of birds they were. And George Lowry thought, that's interesting. I bet I could do something with that. Luckily for George Lowry, there was an astronomer also working at LSU at this time who was a very avid birder. And so Lowry and the astronomer put their heads together and they came up with a set of equations that would let Lowry take a raw count of how many birds he saw passing in front of the moon in a given unit of time and do some math and turn this into an estimate of the total number of birds crossing an imaginary 1 mile line on the Earth's surface at that location every hour. Lowry called this the migration traffic rate. And this sounds kind of abstract, and it is pretty abstract, but the reason this matters is that Lowry now had a way to measure how much migration was happening at one place in time and compare it with how much migration was happening at another place in time. And there really had not been a good way to do that before. There hadn't been a good way to quantify this migration traffic. And so Lowry thought that with this, he finally had a tool to demonstrate the volume of birds passing over the Gulf during migration. So April 1945, George Lowry packs up a telescope and he boards a boat heading across the Gulf of Mexico for a port on the Yucatan Peninsula. That first night, as the moon is rising, Lowry goes up on deck and he sets up his telescope. He's so excited. He points it out at the moon. He's ready to go. He's going to prove George Williams wrong. He looks into the eyepiece. George Lowry had no experience at sea, and he had failed to anticipate the fact that when viewed through a telescope from the deck of a ship, the moon would be bobbing up and down with the action of the waves, in and out of view continually, making it impossible to get an accurate count of how many birds were up there. But George Lowry was not a man who gave up easily, and moon watching, to be clear, you can't only do it on the night of the full moon. You can do it for a few days on either side as well, and it's close enough. So Lowry waited until his boat docked in the Yucatan, where the water was much calmer. There were no more waves rocking the boat, and he tried again. And when he pointed his telescope at the moon over the Gulf in the wee hours of the morning, he tallied 12 birds in 45 minutes of watching. That might not sound like very much, but when he did the math, this worked out to be more than 3,700 birds passing over a 1 mile line extending out into the Gulf of Mexico every hour. So George Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical evidence that trans-Gulf migration, which we now all sort of take for granted, was real. Take that, George number 2. Now, Lowry was just getting started with this. He knew he was onto something big. His next idea for moon watching was that he was going to scale it up and he was going to recruit volunteers from across North America to collect this type of data. Today we would call this, I'll call an effort like this, citizen science or a community science. And there's a whole chapter in my book just about that. In the 1940s and 50s, those terms hadn't been coined yet. Lowry just knew that he had hit on a method that had the potential to reveal migration patterns at the scale of the entire continent for the first time. But this was going to be a huge undertaking. He wasn't going to be able to do it alone. Luckily for George Lowry, a young grad student named Bob Newman arrived on the scene at LSU around this time. So this is George Lowry again on the left, and this is Bob Newman on the right. This is clearly not Bob Newman as an enthusiastic young graduate student. It turns out that in the pre-smartphone era, there were not a lot of photos of people published until they became famous later in their career. So I could not find any photos of young Bob Newman. You'll have to use your imagination, but it works. So like Lowry, Bob Newman arrived at LSU as a grad student and ended up staying on for the rest of his career. And these two men formed a working partnership that lasted all the way until Lowry's death in the 1970s. They both passed away decades ago, so I did not get to interview either of these men when I was working on my book, but I did get to talk to an ornithologist now in his 80s who worked with both of them when he was a graduate student, who shared his reminiscences of these two men. And my impression is that in a lot of ways, they could not have been more different. They were sort of the odd couple of ornithology. Lowry was an old school gentleman naturalist who wore a suit and tie for field work and organized expeditions into the jungle to gather more specimens for his museum. He was a workaholic who would go home to eat dinner with his wife only to sneak back into the office later in the evening to get a little more work done. Newman, our grad student on the right, was a jokester. He had a reputation for his sense of humor. And he also approached problems much more like a modern scientist. He taught himself statistics. Before that was a common skill for zoologists. You did not need to know stats to be a biologist at this point in time. And he also made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research being published all over the world. They seem to have realized that their different approaches complemented each other really well. And together, these two men came up with a plan to collect a snapshot of migration activity across the entire continent during a single week in October. No one had ever tried anything like this before. And this was, of course, before the internet. It was basically before computers. There were, some primitive room-sized computers in the country at this time, but these two guys definitely did not have access to them. So the way they went about this was they spent literally up to 12 hours a day sitting and handwriting personal letters to hundreds of potential volunteers around the country. They did this by targeting local Audubon chapters like you guys, explaining what they were doing and what the goals of the project were and what would be required of volunteers and the special contribution that they would be making to science. And eventually they managed to recruit more than 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada all the way down to Panama. To make sure that the data that they were collecting was as high quality as possible, they even took the step of printing up how-to pamphlets to mail out to all of their volunteers, complete with some tips on staying comfortable for long stints of staring up at the moon through a telescope. This is an actual illustration from one of their how-to pamphlets. After some searching, I finally managed to find someone who had one of these pamphlets and was willing to scan it and email me a copy. And when I saw this illustration, my jaw just dropped. I can't decide if this was maybe supposed to be funny, knowing that Bob Newman was known for his sense of humor, or if it was just the 50s. I don't know, but the very loud pants are a nice touch. Anyway, finally, in fall 1952, telescopes swung into action across North America, and people watched the moon. They, wrote down their counts. Pretty soon, observations were flooding in. Paper data sheets mailed from every corner of the continent were stacking up higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks, and they realized that they had another problem which they should have thought more about ahead of time, which is how they were going to analyze all of this data. So again, no computers. This was before most zoologists had any training in statistics. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration from hundreds of locations. They wanted to look for connections with weather patterns, so they had to look up data on temperature and wind and the movement of cold fronts for each of these locations in printed books of weather records, which were a thing at the time. And they had to depict all of this on easy-to-interpret maps, which they would have to draw by hand. It took them 14 years to complete and publish their analysis. In 1966, their magnum opus finally appeared in the ornithological journal, the Auk, which was one of the same journals that I would be working for about 50 years later, if you remember that slide with the scientific journal covers. They titled this paper A Continent-Wide View of Bird Migration on 4 Nights in October. And it was filled with page after page of these painstakingly crafted maps that used arrows colored in red and black and white to indicate the volume and direction of bird migration at all these locations across the continent. And you could see that in the Midwest and East, there were these massive migratory flights that spanned multiple states, with reports from many locations that were really consistent on the rate at which birds were passing overhead. And they could see how favorable winds and the movement of cold fronts clearly affected these patterns across the continent, with the heaviest migration occurring in front of advancing cold fronts. Those gray swoops on this map are the weather fronts. And I feel like today when we have easy access to, satellite images over the earth and whatnot, it's almost hard to wrap our minds around how amazing this must have been at the time to anyone interested in bird migration to see these patterns laid out at this huge scale for the first time. This paper was a blockbuster. It was 40 pages long. It influenced studies of bird migration for years to come. It was also the last moon watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish together, because all of this hard work was about to be made almost completely obsolete. I almost said absolute. I'm sorry. It's been a long day, guys. Be made almost completely obsolete by the development of a new technology, which was radar. So I'm sure some of you have seen an image like this before. This was taken from the nationwide weather radar system, the same one that you see images from on, the Weather Channel with green and orange blobs to show where rainstorms are. And you can see some rainstorms on the East Coast on this map. But all of these round blobs that you can see mostly down the middle of the continent are birds, migrating birds. So they generally filter migrating birds and other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports, but birds actually show up really well on radar. And so during migration, you see these big sort of donut-shaped blobs, and what you're seeing here is each individual radar station represents one of these blobs. Each of these round shapes is the field of view of one radar station. And as all of these birds are taking off in the evening for their night of flying, they're just completely saturating the area around that radar station and creating this disc-shaped blob on the resulting map. It's quite something. But when people first started using radar in a big way, it hadn't occurred to anyone yet that they might pick up birds. They were not looking for migrating birds, and they were also not looking for rainstorms. They were looking for Nazi planes. So to get a tiny bit technical, just for a moment, radar stands for radio detection and ranging. I actually didn't know that till I started researching this book, that radar stands for something. And the way that it works is it's kind of like a sonar or echolocation, but using radio waves instead of sound waves. So you're sending out radio waves, they're bouncing off of whatever stuff is out there and coming back. And the waves that are coming back at you tell you something about what's out there, how big it is and how far away and how it's moving. British scientists had worked out how all of this works by the 1930s, and so by the time World War II really got going, they had built radar stations up and down the coast of Great Britain to detect incoming planes from the European mainland as an early warning system. But pretty much as soon as these new radar stations were operational, they started picking up some weird stuff. They were seeing these mysterious signals, and which, unlike planes, which as viewed on these radar stations would sort of plod along at consistent speeds and trajectories, instead they were seeing these weird little blips that appeared and disappeared and changed direction and zipped around. No one was really sure what they were looking at. Supposedly at one point, a red alert was sounded and British fighter planes were urgently ordered into the sky to intercept these strange signals over the English Channel, only to get up into the air and find nothing there. So the exasperated radar operators started calling these strange signals radar angels. Hopefully you see where this is going. So while all of this was happening, this guy, whose name was David Lack, had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England. And he did not know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. Lack had always been interested in birds. He had studied ornithology at Cambridge before becoming a science teacher. In 1938, he actually took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to study Darwin's famous finches there. He got back to the UK just as war was heating up, and David Lack later wrote a short memoir about the early years of his career. So I want to read to you in his own words what happened next when he arrived back in England during World War II. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17, so he had signed a pledge to an anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I got to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifists' earnest attitudes and so excited by the flashes and bangs that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. So he's joining the war effort, but since he's got a science background, they want to give him a special science job. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold and the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. It's always fun to discover that the historical figure that you're writing about had a sense of humor. Anyway, once again, you can see where this is heading. Lack was assigned to a job working on radar systems. He was first posted to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland. And he was probably the only person happy to be sent there because the birding was really good and he got to spend his off hours scrambling over the rocky beaches looking for birds like puffins and skuas. But it was shortly after that, on a tour of radar installations up and down the coastline, that he was reintroduced to an old acquaintance of his named George Varley, our third and final George of the evening. It was a popular name for mid-century biologists. So George Varley had been a classmate of Lack's at Cambridge. Varley had actually been an entomologist before the war, so a bug guy, but now he had fallen into the same line of work as Lack. And it was Varley who actually introduced Lack to the mystery of the angels plaguing the radar operators. Now, David Lack was an ornithologist by training. He was familiar with the behavior of birds in flight. He heard the description of the radar angels and pretty much immediately said, guys, it's birds, it's birds. No one believed him. And so Lack and Varley decided that they were going to put their heads together to try and prove that this is really what was going on. They got pretty creative about it. At one point, they convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it aloft in front of a radar station just to prove that it was possible for a bird body to generate a radar signal. Finally, in September 1941, they managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of the signal being tracked offshore in real time was in fact a flock of gannets, the seabird that you see here. As the war continued, Lack and Varley continued to collect radar observations that they believed represented birds, and the technology was advancing really fast, so they went from picking up gannets and geese to being able to detect things like flocks of starlings. And they continued to gather data to show that the characteristics of the so-called angels were consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. Again, it took them quite a while to convince everyone. There were a lot of skeptics. And so I have one more brief David Lack quote because I like his sense of humor. At one meeting, he wrote, after the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Varley, with equal gravity, accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. This guy was snarky. I love it. So they stuck with it, and in 1945, as the end of the war approached, they finally got permission to publish their previously top secret findings in the journal Nature. Today, Lack, who died in 1973, is probably better remembered for a book that he wrote about Darwin's finches, but this publication essentially kicked off the entire subdiscipline now known as radar ornithology. And radar ornithology might have been a footnote in my book instead of a whole chapter, if not for the fact that, of course, after the war, meteorologists started developing radar technology as a way to provide early warnings about hurricanes and other major storms. Now, large flocks of birds show up just as well on weather radar as they had on military radar. So building a nationwide network of radar stations was great news for ornithologists who were interested in looking at large-scale migration patterns. And this continues to be a really important tool for collecting data on these large-scale patterns to this day. When you're looking at weather radar data, you can't really tell what species of bird you're looking at, but you can just get a sense of kind of the density of birds in the air. It's actually quite similar to Lowry's migration traffic rate, just using more up-to-date technology. Didn't mean to do that. So I want to just give one brief example of kind of a recent paper, recent-ish, that gives you an idea of what you can do with this data. So this is from 2018. Two ornithologists affiliated with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology downloaded radar scans covering every evening for 23 years, more than 150,000 individual radar images. And they did a big computer analysis to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure predicted the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Because, you know, migration, it's a season that goes on for weeks, but it's not like there's an equal number of birds in the sky every night, right? There's big nights and quiet nights. And so they wanted to see, like, are those connected to the weather? This is, of course, again, basically the exact same thing that Lowry and Newman were trying to do with moon watching, but now we have much, much bigger data sets and we have supercomputers to help us really crunch those numbers. So in this study, they found that with their math, they could explain almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next based on the weather. And they even found that they could look at what was going on with the weather and predict big migratory movements several days in advance. So if any of you are familiar with Birdcast, which is this amazing forecast tool run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where during migration you can log on to their website and get a prediction of about how many birds are going to be passing over your location that night. This is the technology that Birdcast is based on, and it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire named David Lack. So radar is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And this brings me to my third and final, and I will admit favorite migration innovator that I'm going to talk about this evening. Maybe just because this last one is the only one that I got to meet in person. All right, so this fellow's name is Bill Cochran. This is young Bill Cochran on the left, Bill Cochran later in his career on the right. In the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran working on an electrical engineering degree part-time, while also working part-time for a brand new television station based in his hometown of Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went to check on his employer's transmitter tower on the outskirts of town, and when he got there, he found this guy there picking up dead birds off the ground. Excuse me, my throat starts to dry out. So Cochran was intrigued by this. He started asking the guy, like, what are you doing? Who are you? Why are you interested in these dead birds? It turns out that this fellow's name was Richard Graber, and he was an ornithologist from the Illinois Natural History Survey. And he was studying tower kills, which are this phenomenon where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochran was really interested in this, and he struck up a friendship with Graber. And pretty soon, Cochran, again, the electrical engineering student, was spending his spare time tinkering together gadgets to help Graber in his work. Bill Cochran appears in more chapters of my book than any other single scientist. The first project that he and Graber actually worked on together was, if you're familiar with nocturnal flight calls, these are the unique calls that these some of these night migrating songbirds make while they're flying at night that they don't make at other times. Cochran and Graber were the first to actually make recordings of these calls. And so one of my favorite little anecdotes from my entire book is Bill Cochran figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with a bicycle axle to hold these 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record an entire 8-hour-long night to capture the sounds of birds passing overhead. But the chapter in the book where Bill Cochran looms the largest by far is the one on radio telemetry. So telemetry, if you don't know, really all it means is transmitting data from one place to another in real time. And there were two technological advances right around this time that really helped kick off the field of radio telemetry. The first was the invention of the transistor in 1947. This is a replica of the first transistor. So before this, radios relied on bulky, breakable vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they were sending out. And to take something that is extremely technical and boil it down to the bare essentials, basically what transistors did was they provided a lightweight, efficient, durable way of doing the same thing. And this made it suddenly possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they would not have been suited for before, including transmitting all kinds of sensitive data from place to place. So one of the first groups to jump on this and start experimenting with it was actually the US Navy. They tried things like using radio signals to transmit real-time data on a jet pilot's vital signs to a doctor monitoring them from the ground as they were, pulling G-forces, and to study the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by beaming temperature data out from inside the suit during a test. But it did not take long for wildlife researchers to begin borrowing some of these same techniques. In a way, my whole book is just a history of ornithologists being really good at stealing advances from other fields of science. So, in 1957, some scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's happening here. That's a penguin being manhandled in the lower right-hand corner. And that same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the Jet Pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to monitor their movements around a little nature area. Soon, big engineering firms like Honeywell were getting involved in this, trying to design radio tracking systems that they could market and sell to wildlife biologists to be able to use to follow animals' movements. But they were trying things like strapping a metal box containing a bunch of radio components onto the back of a grouse and releasing this bird into the bushes. And a grouse with a large metal box strapped to its back is not going to last very long. So before wildlife telemetry could really take off, someone was literally going to have to think outside the box. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. And that someone was going to turn out to be Bill Cochran. Now, I said 2 technological advances. I talked about the invention of the transistor. I'm not going to skip the second one, which was the other thing that played into this, was the launch of Sputnik in 1957. I think I'm the only person going around giving talks to local Audubon chapters with pictures of Sputnik and the first transistor in my slide deck. So the way that Sputnik plays into all of this of course was the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviets. All it did was circle the Earth and beep, but if you had a radio receiver and you knew what you were doing, you could pick up this beep from space from anywhere on planet Earth. And this helped kick off a whole new wave of interest in radio technology and what it could do. And so by 1960, Bill Cochran, who still had not actually finished that electrical engineering degree, but was really good with transistors, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois astronomer build radio beacons for some of the very first US satellites being launched in response to Sputnik. Actually, some of the first US spy satellites, although they did not know that that's what they were working on. Cochran was also still doing some work with Graeber and his colleagues over at the Illinois Natural History Survey, the bird people. And eventually someone suggested combining Cochran's 2 part-time gigs. Like, hey, Bill, what do you think would happen if we put one of your radio gadgets on a duck? I don't know, let's try it. So they sent over a duck from the field station on the Illinois River. They strapped a transmitter onto this bird using a metal band that went over its chest. And although they had not planned this, when they released this bird into the air, it turned out that the bird's breathing distorted this metal band in a way that affected the radio signal. And they found that they could actually track its respiratory rate as it flew, accidentally collecting the very first data on the vital signs of a bird in flight. And so they all got a nice little scientific publication out of it to add to their CVs. And that moment when a duck took off wearing a radio transmitter that he had built, heaven knows why, but something clicked for Bill Cochran, and he knew that this was what he was going to devote the rest of his life to. Now, building a radio transmitter that's going to be worn by a wild animal requires making trade-offs among a long list of factors. A longer antenna will give you a stronger signal. A bigger battery will give you a longer lasting device, but they both add weight, and so you have to balance this very carefully. And Cochrane, who would not actually finish that electrical engineering degree for several more years, turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible, and instead of putting all the components in a box, he figured out how to just dip the whole assembly in plastic resin to seal and waterproof everything together while keeping it compact. He started out building, like working with a biologist who was looking for a better way to survey the local cottontail rabbit population, but it did not take him very long to figure out how to build transmitters small enough that they could safely be placed on good-sized songbirds. And this was great news for his old friend and mentor, ornithologist Richard Graeber, who was studying thrushes, which are, relatively good-sized songbirds, larger than something like a warbler, and he wanted to know more about their migratory behavior. But these devices, they only had a range of a few miles. So if you wanted to use one to follow the behavior of a migrating bird, this meant that you literally had to follow a migrating bird. And so in 1965, Graeber, the ornithologist, found a pilot who was willing to try following a migrating radio-tagged thrush at night in a small plane. May 1965, they captured a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois. They trimmed the feathers from a little patch on its back, and they stuck on a tiny radio transmitter using eyelash glue, the same stuff that we would use to attach false eyelashes, which is still really popular for this sort of thing because it's non-toxic and it wears off on its own after a while, and the thing can just fall off. So they waited that evening until the bird took off for its night of flying, and they picked up the signal and lifted off in the plane. And that night, Graeber and the pilot followed this bird north for more than 400 miles before turning around, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. They couldn't see the bird, of course. They were just flying through the darkness, listening to this wavering beep, beep, beep over the radio. But Graeber, the ornithologist, flying through the night, thinking about what this bird was doing in real time as they were following it, was so awed by this experience and so impressed and just touched by this that when he later wrote about this experience for Audubon magazine, he compared it to how he felt watching the television coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochrane, our electrical engineer, was just getting started. In 1973, Cochrane and a student named Charles Welling tagged another thrush passing north through Illinois in the spring. And this time they spent a whole week following this bird almost 1,000 miles all the way across the Canadian border and into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver. They had some wild adventures along the way. Apparently, at one point, Welling, the student who was along to help drive, spent a night in jail because they were driving through rural Minnesota in the middle of the night, and a suspicious police officer pulled them over because who would not be suspicious seeing this thing driving through your little small town in rural Minnesota in the middle of the night? Cochrane did not want to stop for too long for fear of losing the bird's signal and never being able to find it again. So he basically kicked the student that he had along with him out of the car to sort things out as best he could, kept on going until the bird set down for the day at dawn, where he knew he'd be able to find it again later, doubled back, bailed the other guy out of jail, and on they went. At another point, they both came down with the stomach flu and couldn't find a doctor who could see them on short notice in the middle of nowhere, so they just kind of toughed it out and kept driving until it passed. As they went, they gathered data on the bird's altitude, its airspeed and ground speed, the distance it covered each night, its heading, and because they were able to stick with this one bird over such a long distance, they were actually able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north, providing some of the first real-world evidence that birds were using some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their navigational tools while migrating. The only reason they finally stopped after they crossed into Canada was that the car's engine gave out. All right, I'm almost done, I promise. I only have a couple more slides. Bill Cochran never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system for academic publishing. He was an engineer and not a biologist. He was just always a little bit of an outsider. I gather that he might not have been the easiest person to get along with personally either. He was kind of a crotchety guy. He was married 3 times. And by the late 1990s, he had left his job with the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were maybe not great terms. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right into the beginning of this century. I had the great good fortune to speak to Bill on the phone multiple times when I was researching my book, and once even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower, and this station wagon was still in the driveway. He was a hilarious character. He loved to screen his calls by pretending to be a janitor at an animal shelter when he answered the phone. So I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he would pick up and go, "Hello, animal shelter, we're closed." And I would just be sitting there going, "Bill? Bill, is that you?" So he was just a hoot. He was a fascinating man. Sadly, he passed away in 2022 before my book actually came out at the age of 90. And I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science. To be really clear, when we talk about wildlife telemetry, like if you're familiar with wolves and deer wearing radio collars and that sort of thing, all of that goes back to Bill Cochran, not just birds. He was the first person to figure out how to put radio transmitters on wild animals, period. And I'm really happy that my book is hopefully making more people aware of all the cool things he accomplished. I am barely scratching the surface of wild Bill Cochran stories here. This man did so many crazy things over the years. All right, I promise I'm wrapping up. In my last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about why all of this matters for bird conservation. I did first want to address, I chose historical stories from the book for this talk on purpose because I have given this talk for audiences of ornithologists, and I wanted to make sure that I would never be in a situation where I was talking about someone who was sitting in the audience. That just seemed like too much potential awkwardness. So that is why I chose three of the dead guys to talk about in my talk, to be blunt. If you get to read the book, it also covers a lot of the recent developments in the field as well, the latest miniaturized tracking devices and artificial intelligence tools for analyzing big data sets and high volume genetic sequencing. And it's not all old white men. I talked to, a lot of really cool women in this field and people from South America, people from Asia. It was super fun. And thanks to all of these recent high-tech advances, today we really have a clearer and more detailed picture of bird migration than we ever have before. This data can help us target conservation efforts more effectively, and that is a good thing because birds are not doing so great. You might have heard of this paper a few years ago when it was published back in 2019 because it got quite a bit of media coverage. It was nicknamed the 3 billion birds paper because this was a study that drew on many, many different sources of data to come up with this estimate that there are about 2.9 billion, with a B, fewer total breeding birds in North America now than there were in 1970. So this is just a staggering decline. Researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to try and figure out how to stop the bleeding. And so when it came time to write a conclusion for my book and try to tie a bow on the whole thing, I really wanted to tackle this question of whether some of these new tracking technologies might be part of the answer, but also just whether there's any reason to feel hopeful when we are confronted with numbers like this. So what I did, or part of what I did, was I got in touch with a couple of the leading experts on migratory bird conservation today. I talked to Pete Mara, who's one of the senior authors on this paper, and is the former head of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. He's now at Georgetown University, and he's co-founded the Road to Recovery initiative that's grown directly out of this paper. And I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the director of the Audubon Society's Migratory Bird Initiative. I asked them both really kind of laughably broad questions like, what is the state of migratory bird conservation today? And are you hopeful about the future? And they really had strikingly similar things to say. They agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research that's happening now, we still need more data to understand what's behind the declines of many of these species. They agreed that there is a need to better consolidate the data that is being collected and get it into the hands of policymakers and conservation activists, that we need to get better at working across international borders, at incorporating more partners in the social sciences, more perspectives from Indigenous people. And to my surprise, they both insisted that yes, there is still reason for hope. And so I want to close by reading a little bit of what Pete Mara, said to me when I asked him if he feels hopeful when he gets up and goes to work in the morning. He said, "I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past, we've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful just because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that." I thought those were wise words, and I don't know about all of you, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go birding. So that is the conclusion of my talk. Thank you so much to Sarasota Audubon for having me this evening. A couple things real quick. Again, the book is called Flight Paths, and this right here is my website, RebeccaHeisman.com. Obviously, I am not there to like sign books for you in person, but I do have just a few book plate stickers left. If you decide to buy a copy of the book, if you go to my website, there's a contact form there that goes right to my email, and you can say, "Hey, I ordered a copy of your book after hearing you talk to Sarasota Audubon, and I would be happy to sign this for you and mail it to you so you can turn your book into a signed copy." That is also where you can find my monthly email newsletter, which might go down to a quarterly newsletter because I'm not doing quite as much writing these days, but that's where I share things that I am working on and also other interesting bird news stories from around the internet, book recommendations, things like that. The number one question I always get asked is, am I working on a second book? And the answer is no, I am not currently working on a second book, but I still do a lot of other freelance writing. And so I share that there. And yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, but I would be more than happy to take questions if there are any.
Well, thank you very much. That was very intriguing and answers, I think, some of the basic questions that I have. I've been studying swallowtail kites and the different mechanisms, different transistors and equipment that they use that's put on them locally to track them going to and from South America, because they do the Odyssey twice a year from this neighborhood and other neighborhoods down to Bolivia, South America, and then come back. It's an amazing technology, and I'm really glad you're acknowledging all of the pioneers. And I'm sure there are going to be more and more advances. Just hopefully the birds will be there as well.
Yeah.
So questions. Yoli Mariz wants to know that Bill Lowry, was he holding an ivory-billed woodpecker?
I've gotten that question several times. You're very observant. So the black and white photo that I had of George Lowry, sorry, he was holding a woodpecker.
George, yeah.
Yeah, a woodpecker specimen. I'm not, we could go back to the photo. I'm not, I'm stopped sharing now. I'm not completely sure if that's an ivory-billed woodpecker, but it's, or a pileated, based on that photo, but it's an interesting question because the other thing that George Lowry is notorious for is championing some really questionable ivory-billed woodpecker sightings in like the 70s.
Oh,
so
really?
There is a connection between him and ivory-billed woodpeckers, so it might be.
Oh, that's funny, because I had that same thought, and I thought, no, how in the world would I think that was an ivory bill? But I actually had that same question.
I'm not positive, but I think it might be. Yes, several people have asked me that.
Yeah, fascinating. And Yoli also wants to know, is anyone working on a birdcast application which would assist bird watchers find migrating birds on the ground?
Well, I mean, I think that is sort of what Birdcast is intended for, is you can log on in the evening, and if you see that there's going to be a huge amount of traffic in your area, you know that the next morning would be a good time to go out and look. Um, Other than that, I don't know of anything other than really eBird, where of course you can set alerts for bird species that you're interested in your area.
Right, right. Carolyn Primus thanks you for fabulous insights in science. She's ordered your book.
Thank you.
Cheryl Lamb says she doesn't have a question, but just wants to say that was a very interesting presentation, which has made her want to read your book. Thank you.
Some people posted in the chat as well. I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, I saw those, and they're sort of similar questions, and I do want to address those. So one person asked if the 3 billion birds paper gave scientific evidence that climate change is the cause of the declines in bird populations, and then someone else asked if there are specific projects being done exploring the direct relationship between changing habitats and migration patterns and climate change. And so those, I am actually literally this week working on an article for an online magazine called The Revelator about this question of whether climate change is the driver of these bird declines. When that 3 billion birds paper came out several years ago, sort of the prevailing wisdom was that the main driver of these declines, which we've been seeing, you know, over the course of decades now already, has not been climate change. It's been habitat loss, as well as other factors like pesticide usage, probably building collisions, things like cats. I'm sure you guys know the two like top sources of mortality for migrating birds are cats and building collisions. But just this past summer, there were a couple studies that came out, one looking at birds in the desert southwest of the United States and one looking at birds in the tropics throughout the world, that were able to make direct links between population declines in those areas and extreme weather events related to climate change, drought in the desert and heat in the tropics. And so that both did make that connection that climate change is a piece of this. It's really the climate change and habitat loss are linked. So I think it's a false dichotomy to say like, well, is it habitat loss? Is it climate change? Like it's both and, it's not either or. But so yes, there are research projects done being exploring this connection between you know, changes and climate shifting. We do also know that the timing of spring migration in North America has been, on average, gradually shifting earlier and earlier and earlier over the decades, thanks to long running migratory bird observatories. So yeah.
I have a question, and I don't at all mean this politically. Are you? I think originally I contacted you. I wanted you to talk anyway, but I contacted you and asked you about my personal upset that some of the federal programs, which I honestly can't remember right now, were being cut back completely by the current administration. Are you aware of, can you say anything about that? And generally, and maybe you can't. And again, I don't mean this at all politically. Obviously, a lot of different parts of the federal government have been cut back on all kinds of ways, but I'm especially concerned about how it affects migration and study of migration.
Yes. So I had written a story that came out earlier this year for The Revelator, the same one that I'm working on the climate change story for right now, talking about the threat to cut funding for both the Breeding Birds Survey, which is this long-running, I'm pulling up the links that I can put it in the chat to the article that I wrote, this very long-running annual spring bird survey that's carried out by volunteers but overseen by staff in the USGS, and then also the Bird Banding Laboratory, which oversees permitting for all bird banding in the United States, are both part of a division in the USGS that the Trump administration wants to completely eliminate funding for. I am not I'm a science writer. I'm not like a political budget, like government budget writer, so I don't really know how all this process works. My understanding is that this cut of this part of the USGS was not part of the big beautiful bill, so it is not something that has gone into effect yet. It's just part of the administration's proposal for the next year of funding. which I guess is might be the proposal that the government's being shut down over right now. I don't understand all the details of all of it, to be completely frank with you. But yes, so you had contacted me asking if I could give a talk about that. And to develop a whole, hour-long presentation on that, I would have had to do a lot more work. But so I ended up giving this talk instead. But if anyone is curious about that, I put the link to it in the chat there.
Great, thank you very much. And I do think it's really important that we're aware of if they cut back these particular surveys and ongoing research, that's not a good thing for the study of birds or the protection of birds.
Yes, and in the book, I have a whole chapter on bird banding and the history of the bird banding laboratory, and then another one on community science that goes into the history of the breeding bird survey and what it's contributed. So if you're curious about those programs, you could read the book.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Leslie Austin, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Jenny Cherry wants to know, was Audubon able to buy that car with a radar antenna? That should be put into the Smithsonian, much better purpose than the Ghostbusters car.
When I went to visit him in Illinois, when I was working on my book, there was a station wagon. I did not ask him, and I should have, if that was the station wagon. There was a there was a station wagon in the driveway that no longer had the antenna sticking out of it, but sure appeared to be the same one in those photos from the 70s. So as far as I know, he still had it when he passed away. I do have contact information for one of his children. It did not occur to me to ask her what became of the car, but I did have a bit of an email back and forth with one of his daughters after he passed away, which was quite fun. So he was an interesting guy. Many times now I have given this talk and I have had someone in the audience be like, I have a Bill Cochran story. Like every time I talk to ornithologists, someone knew him and worked with him. And like I gave a talk in Santa Barbara, California, and afterwards someone is like, oh, I worked on the project to recapture all the condors and start the condor captive breeding, and guess who flew out to California to build the radio transmitters for the condors when we released them? And I'm like, oh, let me guess. It was Bill, wasn't it? So, yep.
Janet Paisley, who lives here part of the year and in Charlottesville another part of the year, says, thanks so much for bringing this science alive for us. Carolyn Primus again says, best webinar ever.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Humsberger, did that paper from Mara, etc., give scientific evidence that climate change
We talked about that one. Yeah, we addressed that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's okay. You're good.
Somebody else says Anjin Su says, I will spread words about your book and read it myself.
Thank you. I can see the chat, yeah, and I put a couple things in it, so.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Leslie Austin wants to know, are there specific research projects being done exploring the direct relationship between changing habitats and migration patterns and climate shifting patterns?
Yeah,
Thank
we
you so
talked
much.
about that a little bit, yeah.
Rebecca, I think it was a wonderful talk, and thank you so much for all of your work to spread all of this knowledge to us. It's invaluable. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So next month, who do we have, Margie, next month?
We have a gentleman, and I can't remember his name right offhand, but it's very interesting. He is an ornithologist, I think, in a college in Maryland, and he's discovered that veery thrushes time their departure for migration south and back north, I think at least going south, based on what they think will happen with the weather. It's like the veery thrush has a built-in sense of whether or not it's going to be hurricane season. Yes, Karen Willie
Heard
just put the
about
name
that
up.
research. That is super cool research.